So, hi, this is Anthony, and I'm here with Enrique, and we're talking about faith and trying to make sense of the world and perhaps deconstructing faith and everything that gets caught up in that. So, Enrique, I really want to hear some of your story, like you paint it in your own language, but maybe we can start by just how we got connected to each other, because I think it's a fantastic introduction, perhaps, to the story.
It is interesting. It is weird. I don't know how much I don't know. It's a little bit weird there because I had a bit of a resentment towards you
Oh,
without even knowing you, So and then we played ping pong and like I was like, oh damn it. Oh, sorry. I was like, dang it. I was like, this guy's like friendly, so I can't dislike him anymore. No, so
I didn't know that side of the story. That's actually
no.
really, no, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah. I mean, so people probably know that you went to Rice to get your PhD in
Yeah.
math because you're smart like that, and you graduated the year before I actually started at Rice to get my PhD in political science. Still working on it. Fingers crossed that everything continues to go well. But yeah, so you. I don't know how much.
Yeah,
How much
I had befriended a faculty member at Rice, someone I'd done some coursework and some things with. Who you connected with?
Yeah, and it's yes. So she, randomly at a happy hour for my department, she is married to this professor that was in the Department of Political Science at the time, and we were talking about religion, and I was like, oh, I'll go talk to you. So I went to her office, and then she mentioned, oh, there's this guy Anthony, like, we had this guy, and I was like, oh yeah, I was like, yeah, I've heard about this guy. And so then like I learned more about you, and like you know it was just interesting because I don't know, I mean, I don't think there's that many.
Well,
Adventists
she's a professor of like religion and ethics, but she like wouldn't describe herself as religious. She would describe herself as an atheist, right? So
yes, yeah,
so she's like this atheist professor, and you would come in with like some questions about religion and questions like making sense of the world, right? No. I think it's like you go to the atheist professor and you're like, hey, help me make sense of God, make sense of the universe, and she's like, oh. Well, you come from an Adventist background. I know this Adventist guy that just graduated. You should talk to him. And first of all, I'm like, that's an integrity move, because I think if an atheist came to me questioning, I don't know if I would be like, oh, here's an atheist to go talk to, right? Like,
yeah. I mean, I think the way that I was approaching things, it was definitely like, oh, like I just wanted to kind of learn more from, and I think I actually wanted to learn more from someone who was not necessarily an Adventist, actually, because I was looking for a different perspective. And I was interested in her perspective, and more like the resources that she could point me to, because like I think for a few years I've been looking for like resources, and we can talk more about this, because this is, I think, one of the major things that frustrated me as I was like, and still does, as I was having doubts and trying to not necessarily find answers, but like explore those doubts. I didn't know where to turn to, and so kind of connecting with her was like really helpful, because it was like, oh, now I'm at least have some idea of like where maybe where I could start. So, but yes, definitely she told me about you, and I was like, oh, look, like this guy just finished. Like we barely we didn't overlap at all. We missed each other. And also I started going to I was going to this church, to this particular Adventist church here in town, and you went to that church, and so of course I also heard about you from them. So by the time that I when she mentioned you, I had already heard of you.
Sure. Okay.
Because I already heard like, oh yeah, actually we had a student from Rice and he just left, and like, from the pulpit they were like, oh, we lost this like peaches student from Rice, but well, we got another one. And it was like, oh, who is this guy?
Man, I really miss that church community a lot. But yeah, that's really cool. Well, I'm glad that I was able to, I don't know, whatever thoughts you had about me, a game of ping pong was able to convince you I'm a friendly guy.
Yeah, off camera, I can't tell you about that. But yes, I was a little bit like, this guy. And yeah, we played ping pong.
Cool.
I don't even know in whose house because I didn't know anyone. But it was, we talked and I was like, okay, like this guy's cool and like he's interesting to talk to because he was really smart. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I'll put my whatever beef I created myself aside.
Oh, that's so funny. I hadn't heard that aspect of the story before. Cool. Well, let me let you tell the story however you want to begin it. So if you want to go back maybe before grad school leaving or where, yeah, how do you want to tell the story of your life of faith and the doubt, struggles, making sense of living with uncertainty, all of that?
Sure. I mean, I'm a little bit lost here, so feel free to interrupt me and like ask me questions about it because, yeah. So I think, so I guess a little bit about my background. So I'm from Mexico, grew up in Mexico. I was there till I was 18, and I grew up Adventist. If you think that the Adventist church is conservative here in the States, it is more conservative in Mexico. And so I grew up in the church. Maybe as a kid, I didn't really want to go to church, but later on I was like, oh yeah, I'm into this. This is cool. Like, I don't know if I'm just a rule follower and that's why I thought it was cool. But, I always went, I was involved. I was the deacon. Like I would like do like, I was involved in church, right? Like, and so I think when I was in high school, I started going to this high school. I'm from a border town, so I went to high school across the border town, and I was kind of like, I started to have like a different perspective on things. I remember going to this leadership camp because I think it's because I was like vice president of my class, and so we went up to Northern California. Went to this camp. There was a dude that was like, playing some percussion in the worship music, and there was some electric guitar. And like, to me, this was like new, and I was a little bit like judgy about it at the beginning. And then I was like, actually, this is quite cool. Like kind of the same thing. Like, you have your preconceived notions of things. And I was like, this is not okay. But then I was like, actually, was quite nice. And, I that kind of like made me start to think about those kinds of things. And I don't know why at that moment, I felt like I had this epiphany of like, things started to make sense in terms of the Christian story and, why things were the way, I don't know. There was like, the question of like, why did Jesus actually have to die? And like things like that like I felt I mean, I probably had a pretty bad concept of it, but I thought that things made sense. Right. Like all of a sudden, like, and I started to see this and I was like, oh yeah. And I started to think more in terms of like, principles rather than rules, right? Like there may be some rules and there may be some things like that. You have the 10 Commandments, but like at the end of the day, they point to certain principles. So these are larger things and larger themes that we can get from the text, and that it's better we focused on those things rather than like exactly how someone thinks we should follow those rules, right? Because like I was like starting to see like, oh, we have all of these made up rules in our church of how we should do these things. And I was like, they should all, I get the sense they should all point to something larger than that. And so I think that started to create a kind of mismatch between what I thought was the Christian faith and what he meant to follow Jesus and what I saw in the church happening. We're too focused on like, don't dance and don't drink coffee. And like, great coffee right here. And it was just like, oh, don't go to the movies. Like all of the things that like people would like give you the stink eye for. And it's like, this thing's so dumb. And no disrespect to anyone who believes those things. But so I think that kind of started. And then I went to college, and I think that just, interestingly enough, for me, college was kind of, I would say that it was maybe harmful to my spiritual life. I felt like I got disconnected from it because I was no longer really involved in like in church and really doing things. It was more like I go to these things, and I go to church, and I may go to certain events that campus ministries puts on because I need worship credits. But I wasn't part of campus ministries at all, ever. I always kind of like felt that it was very cliquish, and it was like the cool kids who wanted to be hipster and like do all of these cool things. And
so just this is a Christian college you're at.
Oh yes,
yeah, for those,
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, so I went to Union College in Lincoln, Nebraska, right, a Seventh-day Adventist college. So it was same denomination that I grew up in. So I was used to the same beliefs. I didn't have to like really have like challenge them at all, right? If I didn't want to, but I was already starting to challenge them. And then in whatever way, the thing is, like, I went to Union because long story short, I felt that God was calling me to go there. I just had this strong conviction that I needed to go there. It didn't make sense on paper. It just didn't make sense for me to do that, but I just felt it. And so to me, it was just kind of weird to like follow this calling that I felt strongly, and then get there, and for all of that to kind of go away, for me to like just not feel God at all. And it like I think that started just kind of this dry period of like I just didn't feel it. And I think and so I think it was just I don't know. It was just hard. Not that I didn't necessarily didn't believe, because I think in intellectual or whatever, I still believe just fine. And I think like the way I thought about things was changing, of course, as I had different experiences and encountered different ideas. And of course, you may encounter some professors who like have a different set of views, right? Like maybe at the core of it is the same, but other things change, or maybe the way they get at those beliefs are different. And so I started to see, I was exposed to a broader Adventism. Okay. And I think that was helpful, because then I started to see like, oh, I don't have to be just this kind of Adventist to be an Adventist. There's other ways in which I can be an Adventist. And that was very good for me to see, because I was having some doubts, and I was trying to challenge what I saw, or like, I was like, oh, I see this problems in the way we think about God, and in the way of living a good Christian life. And so, at times when you disagree with that, you can feel alone. And so this was like, oh, I don't feel alone, because I see these people also challenging these things and saying like, oh no, we need to be more compassionate, or this is like about these principles, right? The fruits of the Spirit. And yeah, I think that was really helpful. And then I think I would say senior year particularly, and even after, and especially after college, like finishing college and graduating, I started to think much more about like, I don't know, I'm trying to think. I think it was St. Augustine. I was reading St. Augustine Confessions. And at the end of it, right, like it's just kind of, I find it kind of a funny book at times at the beginning. But at the end, he's like writing about Genesis. He just like has like 3 chapters on Genesis, on like the very first, like, I don't know, like 3 verses really. He's like trying to make sense of what this formless void was, and what that also means for like who God is. Like, just that God has to be like larger than that or beyond that. Like not even in those dimensions. Just very heady stuff, Yeah. And I was just kind of like impressed, like, oh, where is it? What century is this dude writing from? And like having these like insights that really make you have to think about the concept that you have of God. And so it just made me think a lot about that, like how expensive and how large do I think God is? What do I think God is? And I think that just started to like, I just started to think about that, and thinking about like I also started to think about why I was a Christian and why other people weren't Christian. Seeing some people just don't seem to have any interest in religion. Just no interest. It's not that they don't like it, it's just they don't care.
Yeah.
But I care, right? But I don't know why I care. And other people don't care. So is this just a personality thing? Or is it just, part personality, part my socialization process? I was like born in that tradition, and so that's what I am. And I was born in a very specific tradition that believes we're the remnant and all of these things. And it was like, so all of these things is coloring the way I see this, and it's a reason why I'm an Adventist, why I'm here, why I believe these things. But what if I had been born into a Catholic family? Or even like, what if I had not been born in Mexico at all, and I had been born in a Muslim country? Would I be a Muslim? Or would I be a Buddhist? Would I be like? And I thought, if that's the case, what would it take me to like accept the truth? Right? What would it take me to accept this Adventist message? Well, first, I would have to hear about it. So like, okay, well, maybe I would hear about it, maybe not. But then once I would hear about it, what do I need to be convinced that that's the thing? And there's plenty of reasons why I wouldn't do it. And the way I was thinking about it actually was the opposite. I was like, let me correct myself. The way I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. But what if, let's say, for the sake of argument, the Buddhists have it right, like 100% right? What would it take me to like convert? What would it take me to say like, yeah, no, you know what? I'm not a Christian anymore. I'm a Buddhist, because like they have the truth. Like, how would I go about doing that? Like, would there be something like that would make me do it? And I was like, I don't think so, because I'm so convinced by my socialization process that this is the truth. Well, to a point. I wasn't like that convinced at that point, right? But like, and I was like, this doesn't make sense. And if God is like bigger than all of this, and like how come there's such a narrow path to him? How come there's such a narrow path to whatever this outcome it is that we're trying to achieve? Which I guess at that point I was still like worrying about the afterlife. I'm not worried about the afterlife anymore. And so like once I kind of thought about that, just the fact that like it was such a narrow path to God, to truth, whatever, it didn't make sense to me. It just didn't make sense. And I started to think about the implications of that. But then I was lost. Because there were no resources. I didn't know where to turn to. If I turned to Adventists, they would just give me all these platitudes and all the reasons why I just needed to believe, blah, 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 or just some weird theory of something that, wouldn't hold up to any scrutiny. Like, and I didn't want that. I was like seriously trying to understand this. I'm still seriously trying to understand this. But just like no resources. Like, where are you going to go? Who are you going to turn to? And who can point you to those things, right? Like we, I think in evangelicalism, not just Adventism, but in other evangelical denominations, right? We exist as a bubble. We have our own schools. And, you go to all those schools, and then you come back and work in organizations that are associated with those denominations. So you kind of just reinforce the same beliefs. You don't question those beliefs. And there are exceptions to this, sure, right? But like, and so it's easy to hold them, and like but the thing is, like, it's hard to know then where to turn to, because everywhere you've been, everybody believes the same things. And if they don't believe the same things, they just leave. Right? Like, that's the option. You don't believe this, then okay, there's the door. There's the door. Like, just like, you can't, because otherwise you just have the same resources that everybody has read, that, I don't know, they had in school. Like, I cannot. I talked to a pastor once, and I went up to him and I told him, hey, I don't think I believe in God anymore. Can we have lunch? And so we had lunch, and I kind of wanted to start with like, I'm not mad at God. Right? Because I think like the first impression that someone gets when like, I don't believe in God, like, oh, something happened, you're mad because, I don't know. I was like, I'm not mad at God. Like, I'm not. I just don't know if God exists. Like, from an intellectual perspective, I don't know if I believe anymore. Well, I don't believe anymore at that moment, right? That's what I was telling him. And the things that I don't feel like I can blame him for not being able to point me to resources that would have helped me think about faith in a different way, or help me where I was at. Because I'm not sure he ever got the training to do that.
Sure. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's not really, I at the same time that I'm like, we don't have the resources, I'm like, I don't blame the people in the system, because I don't think they're trained to face that necessarily. And so, that just became a very difficult thing for me, and just not knowing where to turn to. Here and there, finding things like that were useful. I mean, some people might like cringe at the name of Rob Bell. I'm not gonna say that I'm a fan of like his later stuff, his most recent things, but like some of those things, some of his writings are very good at like creating questions. I don't think he gives answers. I don't think he's trying to give answers, but he's trying to ask, at least in the very early things, like asking these interesting questions that like, deeply resonate with people, and they resonate with me. And through his stuff, I learned about Richard Rohr, this Franciscan priest, who is like has this contemplation center in New Mexico. And I started, reading some of his stuff, listening to some podcasts where he was, and I was like, oh, that's really cool. Like these ideas are like new to me, and I was learning about other, new things. And I don't know. I don't know. If you do you have a question where you that's basically the setup for this, I guess.
No, this is really fantastic. So you raised this problem. Okay, so first of all, there was the issue of you have a very strict like ethical code, or a very like rule-based ethical code that the community is upholding, that maybe doesn't seem to, it's not like a very developed ethic, right? Like you kind of think of like, as ethics develops more, it goes from just like a do this, don't do that, which is like the ethic you treat your like 3-year-old child, to like principles that we then enact and we think through, and how those principles may how various circumstances may alter those principles. And so there seems to be like some initial frustration at like within the community itself. Man, it was just like a little bit too rigid, a little too fail to be reflective enough, perhaps, on some of these things. But then you move to this like more perhaps profound problem of like the issue of particularity. It's like, how can this particular religious expression have anything going for it if like God is like the greatest truth that there is, and you would think like a knowledge of God should be universal, right? It's almost like a problem of like, why is God somehow like hidden, right? It's almost like a divine hiddenness problem. Why isn't like more like of a consensus? How is it that we can get entrenched in different religious traditions, and there seems not to be very good mechanisms for anyone to be like, oh, this is the correct way, like it is the Buddha, or it is whatever it might be. And like I was tracking with that, and that makes sense. I feel the force of that critique. But then it seemed like you shifted to like more fundamental questions about the existence of God. And that's where I'm wondering, like, if you can fill in the gap a little bit. Because it seems like, while I agree that maybe perhaps any particular like sect of Christianity, or any particular, even more broadly, like any religious tradition might seem quite narrow, some like orientation towards the transcendent is quite universal, right? Like this is pretty common in human experience, right? Like it would seem like to question God's existence would suddenly then put you in, again, like a very narrow swath of like modern secular minded individuals, or something that's like not representative of human history, or of even like present human experience, outside of a very small, like sliver of the world. So like, how do you jump from like, oh, this particular religious expression seems very particular, therefore I don't know if it's true, to I don't know if God exists or if he doesn't? Does the question make sense?
I think so. It's just a hard question. I mean, I think partially has to do with like the fact that like sometime in college I stopped feeling it, right? Like the feeling of it just kind of went away. And so then it just became like an intellectual exercise of like, do I believe or not? And then I started to question some of these things. So sometimes I still think like, oh, if I still felt it, would I not doubt it so much? Or even through the doubt, I would like just push through because there's something that I sense it's true. So maybe, so I think that's one thing to like, that I need to consider, like being a determinant of that. Pardon my academic language when I talk about these things. But it just kind of went from like, as I said, like if God is so big, then why such a narrow way? And if this narrow way that I believe is or that I was taught is the one that is true, is I just hold it because that's the way that I grew up? Well, like, but I mean, maybe I should start to question that. And so,
but these seem like these are things that lead you to question the particulars of any religious tradition. Why does that lead you then to question like the more fundamental, like metaphysical claim of like, does God exist?
Because it wasn't just like, does the Christian story it's not just like, does the Adventist faith is the true faith? It's more like, does the Christian story is the true story? Or are you talking about like there's still like an idea in other religions of like this more like this transcendent reality?
I see. So once you begin questioning Adventism, it leads you to question Christianity, which leads you to question religion more broad. Like you just like it's like you pull one out and then they all start coming down.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think is that process of deconstruction, right? Of but it also made me realize like how like fragile or like how fragile the belief system is. Like if you start to pull it apart, it may just fall down. I'm not saying it cannot stand to any scrutiny. That's not what I'm saying. But like it, you start to see the assumptions that it rests on. And now you start to see, so I started to think of like, okay, if I were to believe in God, that there is a God, and that I don't know, if I just have that assumption, like maybe I can get to some things and I'm like, oh yeah, that seems totally fine, but like it rests on this assumption. So do I believe this assumption? And I guess this was also like something that I started to think more about as I started my program, and we were trying to think in a scientific way. And when you have a model, or when you just when you train any statistical model, for example, you have to know what the assumptions are, you're making, because you have to know if your data violates them or not, or and so I started to think like, what are the assumptions of this model? If I think of faith, if I think of the Adventist faith as a particular model of God, what are the assumptions that it's making? What are the assumptions that a broader model called Christianity is making in order to get there, right? And if you accept those assumptions, then like that's fine. Like you can build from that, right? Sometimes we have to like make certain assumptions. We have some axioms from which we start, and we just need to have them in order to build something. But I was starting to question like if those even made sense. That's what I would say. But I'm not now that I think about it, I think it all happened at the same time, that it's hard for me to tell you like, oh, we went from this to this in this order. And
well, I wonder if it's one of these things where it's like maybe in your like upbringing, the way you came to know God was through Adventism. Is that like a fair like way of saying it? Like your experiences of the divine, of thinking about God, of relating to God, and also like your experience of Christ was within Adventism. And so it was like so like theism, Christianity, and gets packaged within Adventism, rather than this like a way where it might be like, oh, okay, I have like some deep commitment to like belief in God, and it's like, I'm very confident of this, 95 or whatever. And then it's like 90% confident of the Christian story. And then, like, as you go more particular, maybe it's like, well, even if these particularities turned out not to be true, I would still have, this bigger context, be it of Christianity or be it of theistic belief.
Yeah.
But I guess it's something like, when you come to like experience all of them together, because it's like, how do we know God? Well, it's in the context of a community, it's in the context of religious tradition. It's like, then suddenly when that particular religious tradition becomes threatened, it can also threaten the whole. Is that fair?
I think so, but actually when you started to mention, so maybe that was the beginning, but when you started to mention that of like, maybe I have like this amount of confidence in the broader Christianity, and then like or like believing that there's something more than the material world, and then like less confidence on like Christianity, and then less confidence, but still some on like Adventism. That's where I'm at right now. That's where I'm at right now. Like, it's not like I'm not there. I think, and I don't think I was questioning Adventism, but like long before I really started questioning God, I was like, oh, I don't think that just Adventists have it right. I think like we should like be working with other denominations, and I understand that we're not like into I don't know how to pronounce ecumenism.
Ecumenicalism. Ecumenical.
I don't know. I'm like, I know we're not into that, but I'm into that. So so I was like already like being like, oh, this is my particular faith tradition, and I believe it holds some important truths. I don't think is the truth. If I were to put it now in like in language that I've learned, I would say like it's a useful model, but all models are neither like right or wrong. They're useful or they're not useful. And so that's the way I think about it. Like, I'm like, oh, is this particular faith tradition useful in understanding the divine? Yes, I think it is. And so I use it. And I know that sounds like weird, but we're gonna talk more about that. But that's the way I think about it now. But yeah, I had started to just think of like, oh, other denominations can also have this valuable things that we can learn from. And then other religions have these valuable things that we can learn from. And then I think like after that is when I started to like have this question of like, oh, but like, what if I had been born into that other tradition? So I think that was like mostly it. And now I'm like at where what you said of like, I do believe that there is something more than the material world. That in terms of my human experience seems true, feels true, rings true. And like the idea that all there is just like the physicality of things, like does not. It is very real, of course, but it doesn't seem to be the whole thing. And so I would start there. And I say, yeah, I believe that. But beyond that, I have no idea. Right? There may be some things that that resonates with me. And so I again, I'm like, oh, this is a useful model. And so I continue to live by it because because I think it's a great way to engage with the divine, because otherwise what would I do? Like, I would just not engage with it. I would think, oh yeah, I kind of believe this, but then not do anything about it, right? And I think sometimes having a system, a framework to think about things, and then struggle with them, that's useful. Otherwise I don't know where to start.
Yeah, it's very difficult to be a theist and merely a theist, right? To like merely believe in God and not to have any organized way of thinking about and like knowing like, how do I order my life in light of this incredible claim that like God exists, right? Like,
right. And what does it mean, right, for my life?
Right. Yeah. How ought I to live in light of this? Yeah.
And so I'd rather go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's an interesting tension where on the one hand, it's like the particularity of any religious tradition, it seems like a little bit odd, like, oh, it's so particular. And it's like, why not just have a more general like theism? But on the other hand, like you almost need that particularity when you actually want to like live this thing out, live it out in community. Think about, how do I conduct myself? How do I like treat the world, treat people around me? Those are like questions that ask for like very particular answers, right? That it seems like religious traditions are trying to grapple with.
Yeah, and I mean, I think once you try them, once you're immersed in that tradition, you can see what seems wrong, and you can see what seems right as well, right? Like you start to see it because you start to practice it, and there's like, okay, this particular practice, it's it's trying to say something about like the way God wants you to it's making a claim, and you can test that claim by like engaging in it and seeing the fruit that it bears. Is it a good fruit or is it not a good fruit? And so you can start to think about that. Like I started to think about it that way. Like I go right now to a they say interdenominational church. People do talk about like the faith traditions that they grew up in. So I find that interesting because I can relate to that. Or like, I grew up in Adventism, so I can see that a lot of the ways I think about God are come from that. Even though even if they're not identical to that now, it's very much influenced by that. And they follow the liturgical calendar, and we have liturgy in the services, right? We read these prayers together, things that I'm not used to doing, that like look very Catholic and like very scary for Adventists to do. Like we're just against those things. And going to a church that follows the liturgical calendar, and there's these prayers that we recite together, it's fascinating, and it's such a different and enriching experience. I love it. I'm like, why don't we have liturgy? Like we're missing out just because like we're so against these things, and like the tradition tells you are against these things, and we're not going to do them. And he's like, oh my goodness, we're missing out because there's this spiritual practice and this discipline here, and we're just like, nah.
Yeah, although you could probably
okay.
No, I was just gonna like you like I jive with it 100%. Like I get it. I find something deeply attractive about high church forms of worship, particularly for how they're connected with history, right? Like we can pray prayers with the saints who have prayed them throughout the centuries. Like that's, and like I like some old hymns because it's like these are the songs that like the church has sang throughout the centuries. Like I think those
that were meaningful then and they're meaningful now. Like isn't that like
they transcend like the zeitgeist. They transcend our particular culture, and it connects you with a deep sense of history. At the same time, I suspect that if one could very easily grow up within that tradition and then find themselves in this place of like, oh, it's so dry and formulaic, and I wish my worship would be more free and have the drums and modern music or off the cuff prayers or whatever.
There's modern music in my church.
Sure. Okay.
Like,
yeah.
It's a combination of things. I think.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. I think like whatever you grew up in, it can start to feel dry and can stifle you. And that's and I completely agree with that. But I think that's exactly why it's so harmful to create this idea that like the way we do things is the right way and everything else is wrong, or like it's just not quite there. Instead of saying like, oh, there's all of these different ways in which people engage with each other, engage with the divine, and like live out their faith, and there's value in them.
Yeah, and I would hope that while certainly like as a religious community, Adventists have probably like attach themselves to some kinds of worship more than others, although I'm sure there's quite a bit of diversity around the world, right? I would hope like the heart or the core of like the Adventist theological package isn't, are you going to recite like what your liturgy looks like, right? Like I'm sure like there are theological implications for liturgy, but it's not like you can have a very high church kind of worship that's Adventist, or that has the same basic theological message about the character of God and about like how God relates to the world. So I feel like that's, I don't know, that's a little, I don't want to say superficial. I mean, it's important because it's how we conduct ourselves. And to some people, it's really important. Like to some people, it probably is the core of their faith. But I would hope, like, as a theological system, that's not really, it's kind of on the margins, right?
Maybe, I mean, the thing is, I struggle with how to really separate what you may think is the right way of doing things, and the like, is it about principles, is it about rules, and the way that this is actually practiced, the way that the church actually looks like. Because it's one thing to say, I think the church should look like this, is what we're striving for. And it's a very different thing where the church is at. And it's like, which one's the real, when we talk about like how Christians are and what Christianity is, which one's real? Our ideal of it, what, and a very particular ideal of it, or the truth. And I just have, or not the truth, but like the on average, what does a Christian look like?
So like, is Christianity defined by looking at like Christians, or by looking at Christ or something? Like, right, like Christ.
But even that idea of looking at Christ, your concept of
Christ. Yeah. I just meant like, we have an exemplar like within the faith, like Christianity points to a particular person as exemplifying like how one ought to live. And then, in some traditions there would be smaller exemplars like the saints or others who have exemplified a Christian life. But you're right, in Christianity we often try to like differentiate these things, and yet it's like, if you're not living it out, that does seem to undermine a little bit of your message or your potency or something, right?
Yeah. And okay, this may be, I feel like even that comment that I made was kind of like driving the conversation in a different direction. But I just thought of something that like truly bothers me, and and I think it points to the same thing of like, I think like, I don't know, I mean, we've all heard of like, oh, we want to be countercultural, right? Like Adventism, like, it's countercultural because we advocate for vegetarianism. I was vegetarian for 5 years. I was like, oh, we serve all this like veggie meat in our cafeterias that probably not healthy for you.
Ton of sodium.
Right. We don't dance. We don't drink coffee. Well, some people don't drink coffee, right? We don't drink Coke. We don't go to the movies.
Do we not drink Coke? Is that a thing we don't do?
I think that's at least in Mexico, that's a thing.
Okay, I don't know.
Anyway, I mean, but like, there's all of these like small rules that like are supposed to like, we go to church on Sabbath, right? Like that's the big one. But the fact that you go to church like sets you apart for a lot of the culture. Like,
I see.
There's all of these markers of behavior that say, I'm different, I'm countercultural, I'm not following whatever the new trend is.
Yeah.
Right. We know, like, no jewelry, right? Like, it's like, oh, we're going to be modest. And so there's all these outward markers of this. And to me, that is like completely missing the point, because the way we want to be countercultural is by playing a slightly different game. Like the game of society is like, and somebody can critique all of my half-baked ideas, that's fine. But like, it's fine, because I want them to get better, right? But like, what I see outside is, and I say outside of like society in general, is that you have to do things to earn respect. You have to do things to earn your worth. You have to do things to just exist, right? Like, you have to you have to make money in order to have a place to live. That's insane. That's kind of like crazy, right? But that I don't want to like sound like a socialist. I'm just saying, like, everywhere you look, you have to do things in order to like earn your worth, right? Like, we may want to push these ideas that like, no, you don't, and that's great. But like, really, like, if you see like a lot of the things you do, maybe, I hope with your friends that's not the case, right? But like, in general, you have to do these things. That's the way things work. And the thing is, like, it works exactly the same inside the church. You have to do these things in order to belong to this group. You have to follow these things. You have to believe these things in order to be part of this community. You have to, and we can go like from different ways, because like we can say, oh, some people would say in Adventism that you have to go to church on Saturday, or else you're not saved. That's not true. And you have to tithe, and you have to not, we can go from like great spiritual practices that if you don't follow, it seems like you're out, like that's it. Like, again, and we may say like, oh no, it is grace and it is by faith, but like, we are keeping track of these things. When we see someone who's not doing these things, we're like, oh, I'm not sure, they're like kind of out there. We start kind of to question whether they belong or not.
So I want to push back on this.
Yeah.
And maybe this is like where you respond to critique of, it's like, if that's how we acted out and that's been like many people's experience, then like that becomes the reality. And so like possibly, but I wonder if it's like, yes, without a doubt, many people have experienced it this way. And maybe that's even become like dominant in some expressions of the church or the church at large. I don't know. But I think like these things you named, actually, like many of them are grounded. Like some of them I just think are silly. Like I didn't know this Coke thing was even a thing. I'm not a big soda drinker, so maybe it never was on my radar. But I don't know. Maybe Pepsi's okay. I don't know. But I think like some of these other ones, like jewelry, which is like, again, I think it's something fading in many parts of the church. I don't. No, like maybe in some circles it's still important, some it's not. But I think like historically, like you can go back to Paul and some of the things he says about adornment, like in the New Testament. And I think what was going on there was he was trying to prevent a class system coming into the church from society. So when he started having individuals, wealthy individuals converting into the church, he was very concerned about them not putting on a performance in the church to indicate they are a higher class. And I think early Adventism was trying to recapture that idea that these distinctions that we might have of status in the world, we don't want to bring into the church because we want the church to make an equal playing field. Now, it's like, if that becomes critiquing someone for wearing a $5 necklace, we've kind of missed the point, right? Like I think the point was supposed to be something about eradicating these like class distinctions that one might have in society. And then same thing with Sabbath. I mean, I think Sabbath fundamentally is the great equalizer, right? It's the day that rest becomes universal. So regardless of if you are a servant or if you are a position of status, regardless if you're male or female, even extends to livestock, right? So there's a sense of like universal rest erases the kinds of like economic, gender, racial, ethnic differences that we have between us, and instead replaces that with a statement of like universal common dignity. I think that's like a really, really beautiful idea. And it's a really, really inclusive idea. It's like really inclusive. It's this thing's for all of us. Now, if that's become like turned into over the years into a kind of like in-group marker, right? Like if you keep Sabbath or not, you're either in the group or you're not. And how you keep it shows if you in the group inside the group, and then you have like, it becomes a boundary marker. Like, okay, like I guess it makes sense that happens within religious communities or any kind of community, that you have these like boundary markers that differentiate groups and subgroups from each other and from those outside the group. But like, man, there's a theological core there that's just all about erasing those kinds of distinctions and being the great equalizer, right?
Yeah. So first, I'm here, like I am, the reason I talk to you is because you'll push back.
Yeah.
But second, you are actually making my point here.
Okay.
Of like, so if you're worried, if people are worried because they're giving a checklist of whether I'm an Adventist or not, I tithe, I keep Sabbath, I believe these are like beautiful practices. The only like jewelry, if it counts, that you'll see me wear is this Fitbit. Like, I'm with you on that.
That's Adventist health message right there. I think that one's allowed.
Yeah. If it's an Apple Watch, it may be too much because that's too expensive. So check your hearts there, people. Adventists with Apple Watches, but. So that's the thing though, like those things you mentioned, like that's actually why I keep Sabbath. That's why I believe like these are like profound spiritual practices that I decide to practice, because they point to a truly countercultural like way of being. That is the truly countercultural way of being. Like, it is saying, like, there is no list of things that you have to do or to follow for us to like believe that you belong here in this community if you want to be here, and that we see your worth, right? That we all have inherent worth, because God made us. Like, that's the countercultural thing, that like we say we don't want to play by these same systems, that like you have to do these things in order to be part of them.
Yeah.
And in the way that and so I, as we were saying, like, we can have this is our idea of Christianity and what we're striving for, and yet in practice, and I don't actually think that a lot of people are actually striving for it, in practice is like, no, like you have to follow these things because some of us are going to get saved and some of us aren't. Right? And so you have to follow them. And you see the same, the thing is, like, you see this stuff clearly in some parables. Like, it is so clear. The parable of the workers, right? They come at different times, but they all get promised that a day's pay, right? But they all come at different times. Some of them only work for an hour, and yet at the end of the day, they all get the same. And people who start working from the beginning, they complain about it, right? Because the system that they're operating under is like, I did all of this work, therefore I deserve all of this reward. It is, they're trying to earn God's grace, right? And we act the same way. Like, we're still acting in the same way, and that is like so frustrating to me, because it's like, oh, we're trying to be countercultural by like doing all of these different things. And I mean, now it's even sadder, because like you'll have like this like not in Adventism, but in Christianity in general, in the US, you'll have like those big concerts that look just like any other concert. So like, it's not even that countercultural anymore. And it's like, have all of those things if you want. That's fine. Like, do the things you want to do. But if you're not getting what I think and what it seems you think is the core message of it, then it's like, you're not like.
So I'm really interested now. Because I'm listening to you. I'm like, you're on preacher mode. Like, you're this guy at pulpit, right? and I'm just thinking about how, like, at the heart
I wanted to go to seminary like 2 years ago. I was like, I was about to drop out of PhD.
well, no, but I think there's something to this, right? Like I think something that's quite attractive about Christianity, and perhaps isn't exclusive to Christianity, but it definitely prominent within it, is its capacity for self-critique. And that's not to say that we've always embraced that, but like, if you even go back to our foundational text, like what was Jesus doing? He was primarily like critiquing his own religious system, right? Like our religious exemplar.
That's what the prophets were doing in the Old.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. There's
right?
The prophetic ministry that was exemplified in Christ, that continued to be exemplified in the apostles, and then I think more particularly within Adventism, it's like Adventism was born out of a self-critique of Christianity. It was a very pronounced self-critique, and I think that now when it's like I hear these critiques of be it Adventism or Christianity or whatever it might be, it's like, yeah, but that's like a very Adventist thing to do, right? Like that's a very Christian thing to do, right? Like I don't think this critiquing is moving you further away from the religious tradition. It's rather like moving you deeper into it, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I when I talk about these things, to me, even though I'm moving away from certainty, I feel like I'm getting closer to some truth. I don't want to say the truth, but I feel like I'm getting, I'm getting it. It's more and more meaningful, and I see more and more meaning in the tradition that I come from, and other traditions. Like I'm leaning more into them, even though I'm not sure if God exists. The thing is, like, so I was reading, I'm reading right now, Searching for Sunday, I think it's called, by Rachel Held Evans. And there's one part where she says that like the Jesus story is the story that she's willing to be wrong about, or something like that. That's the reason she's in it. And I was like, yeah, actually, like that's kind of it. Like I don't know if this is true, but when I accept that if I just kind of accept by faith, right? And faith is like you don't really know. You choose to believe. You make this affirmation that you believe. And if I accept the idea that God is love, and that if I just go with that, if that were to be my only model of God, God as love, right? And then I see, in this tradition, how that is represented, how love permeates in like many parts of that tradition, and that's the way that I decide to actually engage with the divine and with others. And I see that that brings good fruit. And like, of course, I use all this religious language because that's the tradition I grew up in. But like, if it bears good fruit, then like I'm gonna continue doing it because it seems true. There is something about like sharing a meal with people, like eating with people is like so profound. It's such an ordinary thing to do, and yet it's so sacred, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so, and like keeping Sabbath, like it's like this for the rest of the week. I'm like feeling so bad about like how I'm doing in my PhD program. Like I'm behind and I don't know, and what am I gonna do with my life? And Sabbath comes and it's like I've learned to put all of that aside. To like, no, like I have worth, that it's not dependent on what I do, on how good I am doing research, and I can just be.
I think it also works in the really good weeks when you're like feeling so great about what you do in your PhD program.
Sure. Yeah.
And Sabbath's like, okay, don't think too much of yourself.
Yeah. No,
it works, I think, both for the lows and the highs. It's actually really, really nice.
I mean, it seems like that happened to you more often than to me, but
Oh,
sure.
no. I had plenty of low weeks without doubt. I love this. And I think there's, I think we're in this great place where like I think there's a lot of people who became very like tired and burnt out of religion, and like in the 2010s there was a lot of like people mad at God, like God doesn't exist, I'm angry at him. And then we kind of move to this place now where perhaps it's better characterized by like God doesn't exist but I miss him. Right. And there's I think there's and there's still plenty of people mad and angry, but like I think we're kind of past the like angry atheist like internet stage, and now we're more of a lot of people who maybe still have wouldn't identify as necessarily believing in God, but have some sense of nostalgia, some sense of something lost, or even can affirm like the value of religious community and tradition. What I'm interested in is you freely keep saying like I don't know if God exists. I want to understand a little bit better what that means, and then also I'm wondering like if you feel like that there's some cost, like not knowing that God exists, maybe that entails like maybe you feel like you might be missing out on something, right? Like, is there something that if you could be more confident in God's existence, you would have some like and be able to enjoy these goods, right? Like maybe you can only get so much out of the religious tradition. You can get a lot out of it. You can enjoy it. You can value it. But maybe you feel like you can't fully tap into some elements of it. I mean, like here's one that came to mind. Like if you say like I do not know that God exists, does that entail as a corollary I do not know if God loves me, right? Like if I don't know that God exists, like I don't know that I'm loved by God, right?
Okay.
Like if there's a God, then he loves me, right? But like
Yeah.
I don't get to maybe walk through life every day with the assurance that like I am the beloved of God or something like this, right? That seems like, wow, I'm missing out on something there, right? Like that's
I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there some sense of like not being able to project greater confidence in this or something like this makes you miss out on some kind of good?
That's a great question. So when I say I don't know,
Yeah.
it's more like I believe I say that I believe there's something more, right? But I don't know if that more, if like we would just want to call it like a creative force, has like
Personality.
I don't know about a personal God. I think that that's more the thing that I am like sure about. Is God really a personal God? And yeah, I guess the consequence of that is that if it's not a personal God, can like that impersonal God really like love you and like share that with you. But if I think of God as love and like you know, like it will be more of like it's present everywhere. And I don't want to get too pantheistic here, but like it's like it is part of how things were created. Like I don't want to get too philosophical of like some of the thoughts that I've had that are not well formed. Because I'm still like working through some of that stuff. But for example, like things like, you know, that Christ existed from the beginning, that Christ was in the beginning, and that through him all things are made. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that may tell me that like there's at the very least, we would reflect something of that creative force, right? We would hold something of that creative force. We would reflect it, because that's, you know, when someone creates something of them is in that thing, even if they themselves are not in it, you know, like, anyway. So, but yes, I think like more in terms of like, here's a good example of what I think I'm missing out. Sometimes I'm at church and we're singing a hymn or some worship song, and I cringe at the lyrics. I'm like, I don't know that I believe that anymore. I'm not sure about that particular thing. And so I can no longer enjoy certain hymns or songs as well. I have to like kind of like, I feel like I have to like shut down my brain and just like, okay, don't think about the whatever thing you disagree with here. And so that kind of sometimes sucks. And then sometimes I do think like, man, I would really, I'm feeling really low. I would really love to just feel that everything's gonna be fine, and that may require, and that I'm loved by a personal God. And I think in those moments, I allow myself to be like, yeah, let's suspend belief for for a second, or actually activate belief for a second, and enjoy that. Because sometimes I'm like, yes, I mean, I am like jealous sometimes of people who like just seem to believe and who are so sure. I'm like, how are you so sure? You seem to say you're experiencing God and your relationship with Jesus. I'm not. I haven't experienced that since college. So I don't know what you're talking about. You could be faking it for all I know. Especially if you're a pastor, your job depends on it. So like it's hard. It's hard for me to know, because I don't like, I
could be faking it, or it could be like maybe a little naive, right? Like maybe you haven't like reflected enough upon the questions I've reflected upon, or maybe you haven't read enough of whatever, that like you still have almost like childlike faith, which could be a pejorative or could be a praise, depending on how we're thinking about it, I guess.
But I think you're right. There's things that I feel like, I mean, this is a, you know, sometimes people call it a faith journey. I definitely think this is a journey, and I think things have evolved for me a lot in the way I think about things and the way I see things, the way I experience things. Like in the past couple of years, the thing for me has been to see the sacred in everything, to really try to see Christ in everyone, and see God's love reflected in creation, in all of in whatever it is. I deeply enjoy my routine of making coffee. I am like a snob, and I make my nice, I grind my coffee every morning, and I make my V60, and that is just such a fantastic, like just the aroma of the coffee coming out, like that is just a fantastic experience. And then drinking that coffee is great. Sitting just to read, like just like seeing all of these things as like, oh, like why do we have like this big distinction between what is sacred and what is secular, or what is like or if we think of the liturgical calendar, what is sacred and what is, or what it, you know, all this I actually see this is how, you know, I'm not experienced with the liturgical calendar and I'm new to it. But you have ordinary time, right? Like where the feasts are not happening, all of these high times are not happening, but like seeing the good things in ordinary times as well. And so to me, right, any meal can really be a sacred time. And to just like not have to like compartmentalize where God is going to show up so much. And so I'm not sure, like, I mean, at that time I'm having such a something that feels like such a rich experience that, you know, maybe some people wouldn't be willing to call it like, oh, that's God. But like, why not? Like, let me, like, if that's the way that I'm going to like experience God, because I feel like in this more highly stylized way I haven't, like, okay, I'm gonna take that. And I understand that for some, like, that may sound like a little bit like heresy, but I mean, the way I see it is like, if God created everything, if that's what we believe, then like the consequence of that is that, or the color, can't pronounce that word, sorry. It's that, is that there is good in everything, right? Like, we know that we know, like, that we have ourselves these tendencies to mess up and tendencies to be selfish. We know it, but we also know that we're capable of good. Right? Like, we can sense that, and we can sense that there's good in things that are not particularly like religious, or you know, I guess it's okay to make the distinction between what is religious and what is not, but like less about what is sacred and what is not. You know? So yeah.
So you had this line you just said that I love. You said there are times when you don't know if God exists, but you choose to like activate belief. You're like, let me just like, and I actually I love this idea that I think that when you're young, faith very much just comes out of a form of like certainty, because it's kind of like that's the only thing you're pretty certain of it, and so like that's very much like these things are tied together. Then as you grow up, like you lose certainty in a lot of things, right? Like in about every domain of knowledge, you are losing.
Some people do.
Well, yeah. I mean, but I think what you have to learn to do is like you let commitments replace certainty. So although I may not have absolute certainty, like I'm able to, maybe before certainty looked something like this was my only way of seeing the world, and now I can hold like two different worldviews at the same time, right? And this is like almost like what doubt is by definition, like doubt coming from like a root of a duo or two. So I have like two ways of like, oh, maybe God has caused the sun to shine upon me, or maybe this is just like a meaningless whatever like natural occurrence, right? And so it's like you no longer have like maybe the innocence of only having one view of the world, but that's where like choice comes in, right? And that's where I think commitments come in. And maybe one way to think about faith is like a habitual choosing to believe, or something like this, right? Like a life of faith is like developing a habit of not like ignoring like other ways of thinking about the world. Like you can hold on to those and be like, oh yes, there's many ways I could conceive of the world, but like I'm going to choose to believe. And I love this prayer where it's like the man prays to Christ. He's like, I believe, help my unbelief, right? Where it's like these things don't have to be.
I used to pray that every day for quite a long time. Did not work much, but I'm still here.
Well, I mean, it didn't work much. Maybe if you think like the purpose of the prayer, I believe, help my unbelief, is like get rid of my unbelief, then like maybe, but like maybe that's not like the resolution to that. Maybe like the resolution is like sustaining belief even while unbelief persists, right? Like the resolution doesn't have to be like let's get rid of that unbelief, but it's can we learn how a life of faith can persist even while one. I mean, especially now, like in so there's this Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor who has his big work, A Secular Age, where he defines secularism as essentially it's characterized by us being in constant contact with those who believe differently, right? And so it's like, well, it's not like I'm going to live in a city anymore where everyone believes exactly the same as I do. And so like if I'm in constant contact with people who don't believe, in some sense, like doubt becomes inevitable, right? Like in some sense, like and maybe like not doubt in the way that we might use as a pejorative, but just like some basic like, people view the world differently. Like there's more than one game in town, right? There's more than one show in town. Yeah. But then also realizing like on the flip side, if it's like the believer's doubt is doubt, then like the skeptic's doubt is faith, right? Like the people on the other side who are like, I wonder if I'm missing out on something. I wonder if there is another way to like order my life in light of the transcendent, or however people express it. And it's like everyone is in this like tough position of like, we all live in these like communities, like we're in constant contact with those who have different ways of seeing than us. And I guess one reaction is like, let me bunker down and like entrench myself within like one way of thinking, and like close off access to everyone else, or like vilify them or something. And like we certainly do that in politics, but probably that's not the best way to go. And so like, what's the alternative? Well, we have to learn like some mechanisms for learning how to navigate lives that will have both moments of doubt and moments of faith. And so I think it becomes more about that, learning to act out commitments and forming habits of choosing to believe, rather than like hoping that you can return to a place of certainty where you're no longer bothered by any opposing thought.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing I was thinking about when you said that is like, there's so many things that I can like, of why I think we should doubt the things that we were handed down and things that we believe, like from like seeing the Bible as inerrant, like the history of the Bible and the translations that it's gone through, and even like putting together the Hebrew Bible to begin with, like all of those things are fraught with error. So to me, like those kinds of positions, like kind of like I'm not sure about them. But that's a different rabbit hole. But my point here is that there is, even if we weren't to do that, like if you just think about the ways that we think, how humans think, our use of heuristics for basically everything, right? That we have, if you've read Kahneman, we have system 1 and system 2 of thinking, and most of the times we're in system 1. We're just automatically processing, because we're processing a ton of information all the time, and there's no way we can actually consciously do it and slow down to really think about all those things, right? So you're going to tell me that such like, and as impressive as the human brain is, and the kind of process that we can the kind of impression we can process, like you're going to tell me that we can actually understand God and like know all this truth, and that like humans have been involved in this process and we didn't really mess it up. So starting from that, I'm like, yeah, okay, but we don't have to really think about it. What we can say is like, we know that we have these mental models of things for everything. Like we create a mental model of like why we think people do certain things. We have mental models of how an Adventist is supposed to act. We have mental models of how a Catholic is supposed to act, how an atheist is supposed to act. We have all of these models of like that would predict certain behaviors for different kinds of people, right? We have different models that do that. And we just like bring them to mind when we need them, right? That's what we do. And so what is the implication of that? Like, we know that some of those models may be wrong, because like we've been proven wrong before about certain things, right? We all have models that was like, oh, we have this preconceived notions, like, oh, I don't really like Anthony for these things, but dang, we played ping pong. He's such a great guy. I need to update my model. Now I need to change my model. I need to update it because I have new information, right? And we can either refuse reality and not update it, or we can actually like take a more humble position and say like, okay, I have a new data point. This looks different now. My model does no longer fits this, right? No longer fit the reality. And I think, and I actually preached a sermon about models and God when I was in Mexico City once. I did my best at trying to convey this thing. And like, as I was working through this thing, because I was actually applying the same framework to how I view God, was that, like, as I said, like models in science, when you have a model, the question of whether the model is right or it's true or not, like, doesn't make a lot of sense. Like a model is like we have to simplify the thing, and especially if it's a statistical model, we have a mathematical model of things. Like not necessarily, we're not saying like that's the way things are. I mean, you may think that's the way things are because you're a mathematician. You're like, everything is math, but like,
I don't hold that view at all. But yeah.
But like the real thing about these models, and like, it's Are they helpful? Are they useful in understanding this particular thing? And sometimes that means that you take a certain angle of things. So like there's this classic textbook that uses the idea of like a train. It's like, well, if you're trying to model a train, what are you going to focus on? Are you going to do it are you trying to do it on scale, or are you trying to like if you care about, I don't know anything about trains, but if you care about like a certain part of the train or a certain system in the train, like your model is going to show that. Or if you are trying to map a subway system, is that going to be to scale? It's probably not going to be to scale because that's not what you need. And so are you like, is that map true? Well, what do you mean by that? Right? Like that question doesn't make a lot of sense in this thing. The question is it useful to understand the thing you're trying to understand? And I think that we have too much confidence sometimes in our models of God. Like we have a model of God, like God is this and God acts in this ways. And I think we like our model way too much, and we place too much faith in the model of God rather than in God, right? Like this is the same idea of like placing God in a box. Like you have this model and like God can only act in that way, and you're not letting God do his or her thing because you're like, no, this is the model. This is the model, and I'm not going to update it because like I was told this is the truth. And I think sometimes we have too much faith in those concepts of God, and we are not willing to be like, actually, like I may be wrong. Like if it's a useful model, it's fine. Like the thing is, like my position right now is like I have this model that I use, but I'm not sure if that model is right. Model seems to be useful, and I can try other models. Like I can go to a church that has that follows a liturgical calendar. I'm like, oh, there's something useful there, and I can update my model. But I have much less confidence in the model itself, and so I'm just like not. And I think that's what I mean. Like I don't know who God is. Like so I don't particularly see like this model is like, I don't know. I think I'm trying to approach this with more humility of instead of thinking that I know what it is. And I may be completely wrong. It may be actually that the fundamentalists have it completely right. I hope not, but it may be. I don't know what you can get from that, but I hope so.
I appreciate the emphasis on intellectual humility, on recognizing our cognitive biases and limitations, and certainly we understand how like we misapprehend like the physical world so much more would we expect to misapprehend the spiritual, supernatural.
That is a point I should have made.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a point a number of mathematicians have made throughout the years that I really appreciate. Like Euler has a line along these lines. Pascal has something similar. But I think this is like
none of this is like I don't think I have this great thoughts. All of this is like things put together from different places.
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes we have to like every generation has to rediscover these things, right? Yeah. But it's like I like the story a lot. I think it's a really important story. I think it's a really important corrective to a lot of like religion. At the same time, it's a very human story. And while I resonate entirely, like if humans are involved in the process, it's going to be like messy and wrong and all these things. It's like, yes, but also like if God is involved in the process, then maybe there's something like still reliable within it. Right. And so I don't exactly know what to do with that, but I think it helps to not only like think like, oh, if it's just up to like chance and up to my cleverness, would I like come to the truth of who God is? It's like, no, but like if there is a God and God is interested in being known by you, then like many other ways and mechanisms through which God can draw you to that knowledge. And maybe that doesn't look like everyone converting to a particular religious sect or whatever. But I think it's like just as skeptical as I want to be of human like reasoning and human models, I also want to like be just as like leave as much room for God to work through whatever means he might have to somehow like overcome those limitations, right?
And that's part of, I mean, I struggle with that, and like I think like I exist within that tension as well. But that is actually, I think, part of me saying like that I'm not sure that I'm right, and like the thing is, like, I don't actually care if I'm right, like, because I don't think that's what this is about. Like, I don't think, I think, and this kind of goes back to the idea of like, oh, you need these certain beliefs to be saved, right? Like, even if we don't truly believe that, we kind of act as if we did, and I'm like, no, like, I don't think that's as important. Like, I am trying to honestly relate and experience the divine in the best way that I can. Like, and we can point to Micah 6:8. Like, I'm trying to live that out.
Yeah.
And it looks like this for me,
Yeah. So I think the statement of "I don't know" is a statement of humility. I don't think the statement of "I can't know" is, because now one is actually making a pretty bold claim, like, I know with certainty that I don't have the capacity to know this.
I don't think we can. I don't think we can be sure. I don't think we can be sure. But yeah, I mean, part of my position is like, I do think that, like, I do leave room for the possibility that God actually is doing something and working, because I know there's been times where I felt that that's what was happening. And I can right now point back and be like, oh, well, it makes sense because of these things. And I can rationalize it very well. We are super good at rationalizing all of the decisions we make. And so I can do that now and say like, well, I think that happened because of this, and that, and give you very, like, take away all of what felt like a very spiritual experience at the moment. But I kind of don't want to, I'm like hesitant to do that, because that's not the way that I experienced it in the moment. And I'm not sure. I do leave that room open to it. And so I come back and forth, but the thing is, I don't think that believing the right thing is really what it's important. I think believing, let me put it this way. I think your beliefs are important because they dictate your behavior a lot of the times. And our theologies are definitely going to dictate the way we see others, the value we give them, and so I think that's definitely very important, right? I think there's a lot of really damaging theology out there. And so I think, I'm not saying that doesn't matter. It does matter. I don't think it matters for whether you are loved by God, whether you have inherent worth, whether you belong to the church. I don't think that's what it matters. And like, that's difficult because it means that those people that I really dislike, who have very damaging theologies, I have to accept that they're still part of the body of Christ, right? The people that I still criticize and the people that I say they have like horrible views, they're part of this too.
Yeah.
And so it goes that way too. Like, it's not just like saying, no, like, they're not real Christians. No, they are real Christians, right? Like, I don't think they're living like Christ, but I can't say they're not Christians. They're part of the body of Christ. They're it's a bad look, but it is the look. It's like what the church looks like, whether I like it or not. I cannot write them off and say they're not Christian. Like, I would be doing the same thing that I am complaining about.
Yeah, I guess maybe at some point I would think that there are some boundaries, but I certainly agree with the spirit.
But that's it. That's the thing, though. It makes it's a very uncomfortable. Like, if you want to take that to its extreme, that's where you know if you believe it or not. And that's the thing that, like, to me, that's what I was doing with those. That's when, at the beginning of it, when I was in college and I was starting to doubt, that's what I was doing with those beliefs. I was like, what does holding this belief actually mean? Like, when I take it to the extreme, what does it mean? And am I comfortable with that position? Do I think that actually reflects who I think God is? And so that's why I wanted to take, like, sometimes I want to take this beliefs to its extremes. Like, I know, like, maybe some boundaries we want to draw them, but I'm like, okay, like, maybe there's a conversation to have there, but like, if at the extreme, that's like, I remember like at some point reading YouTube comments, and there were Adventists always like saying like, no, but like, can you be safe if you don't go to church on Saturday? and it would make some people really uncomfortable because like people wouldn't want to say yes. People wouldn't want to say yes. They would want to be like, well, but if they truly believe and like, I hope that the Holy Spirit at some point is going to convict them that they will go to church on Saturday. But it's like, you're adding a condition there. Like if you take it to the extreme, like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm being clear, but I just think
I mean, I certainly agree that like salvation isn't achieved through your set of beliefs or your like set of actions, right? Like salvation is through God's grace via the person of Christ. So I wouldn't think that, like I think this is like a very Christian thing to say on the one hand. On the other hand, like there are 2,000 years of Christian history wrestling through how do you take the doctrine of salvation via God's grace and then understand what that means for the significance of how we live our lives, right? And so like this is probably a good thing to wrestle with. A lot of people have for a long time, and that's
and I'm not saying we shouldn't think through these things. I mean, sometimes I'm like wonder how much of this just an intellectual exercise it is, especially for me. I just find it fascinating. But like at the end of the day, for like the way that I like, I don't know, in terms of it defining whether I'm in or not, and in terms of me defining whether others are in or not, to me, it's like, no, that's not it. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to point out the things that I see wrong in the thing, right? Like, doesn't mean that I'm not going to point out what I see as wrong. Like, I mean, we're called to do it, right? Like I really dislike when people are like, oh, do not judge. The Bible says do not judge. Well, I mean, do not condemn someone and write them off. For sure, I definitely agree with that. But there's also like instructions of correcting someone in love, right? I think once you're in the community and you know that thing is not going to get you out of the community, like that's a different thing. Like if I come to you saying like, hey, I think this is wrong, but you know that I'm not going to write you off because of it, that's a very different thing.
Yeah. Okay, good. We've covered a lot. We've covered a lot. This has been great. Have we engaged with the core stuff that you really wanted to? You think we is there some area we've missed or we want to?
No, I mean I think that's enough. I feel like I've been rambling and we've talked before, so you already know kind of how
I think you're in preacher mode. I think we need to get you in front of a church right now and let you go all prophetic on them.
Let me tell you that there been so many times that I'm like, oh man, I want to like go to seminary, but I don't know that any church would hire me afterwards because they'd be like, well, we don't know if he believes in God or not. And I'd be like, yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah.
But no, I that's the thing. I think that's the weird thing here. I'm much less certain of things, but I also find all of this much more meaningful and important and valuable for the church, but for the world in general. I think, if we were to follow and imitate Jesus's life, like that would be a much better look for Christianity. And so I truly believe that, and kind of that's in the book by Rachel Held Evans. I'm like, I'm okay being wrong about this story. Like, it's fine. I'm okay with that. And I mean, I hope that I know I can be all over the place. At some point, someone told me you need to write this down, and they didn't say it as like you have great insights, you should write this down. It was more like you're like all over the place.
Well, no,
you really need to figure out where you're at.
Yeah, I mean I think one of the power of writing is it teaches you to order your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
And often like you can speak most effectively on something after you've written about it.
Yeah, I agree. Not to plug my the stuff I've written on my blog, but like on my website, like that idea of like the models of God and that kind of stuff.
I think I'm much more coherent. How do we get there?
Oh my God, that sounds like I'm playing. I'm definitely. Well, now it's like my name, but like that's hard. If you just look up my name on Google, it should appear. Because if I tell you it's E and then both of my last name Quesada Llanes, that probably doesn't mean much, and I'm not going to spell all of that. But Yeah, no, I wrote about that there, and also this idea of trying to see the holy in ordinary things. But in terms of like this bigger set of ideas, no, I think I'm still like quite confused by it. But maybe I should actually follow that advice and try to write it down. I think I'm hesitant because I know there's a lot of things I don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'm like kind of afraid of like putting something out there that is like.
Well, I mean, you can also just write it for yourself. It doesn't have to be.
Oh, sure, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just kind of like another incentive.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
But
that's
true.
What I took away from this. So, I mean, I
I'm
think
such a narcissist, you know. I'm like, oh yeah, putting it out there so people can like hear my great thoughts.
Well, maybe some of these things that gets stuck in a journal somewhere and published in 100 years or something. But
yeah, because I'm gonna be that great a thinker that people will look through my stuff.
No, but I think what I took away from this, coming back to this idea previously, like we live in this secular age. We all have to come up against these questions of faith and doubt and belief and unbelief. And so I'm not really bothered by forms of agnosticism or whatever one label one might put on it. I'm much more concerned by apathy, right?
Yeah.
Like that's like when someone like,
yeah,
it's like doesn't want to have the conversation, isn't thinking about it, isn't wrestling with it. It's just like, yeah, apathetic. And you could be apathetic like as a Christian and just be like call yourself a Christian, but like not really like it just doesn't play any role in your life. So apathy is apathos, without passion. If there's no like animating passion of like in your life, it's like, well, that probably has me much more concerned than someone who is like, oh, I just really want to know, and I have some really sincere questions, and like I choose to believe, but sometimes it's hard to believe, and I don't know if I can believe, but I think I can believe. Like I'm just like, yeah. I mean, that's like that. There's pathos there. There's engagement. There's interest. There's like something alive in that, right? Maybe one might even say like, the spirit is at work there, right? So
one might say that.
So I'm not at all like concerned or anything like this, and like I think this is actually a really exciting place to be, and I'm really excited to hear some of the story you shared us today. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity to share it, and I hope it resonates with people. I think, if somebody who listens to it is having doubts, I think like that's. I hope they, it for me was helpful when somebody said these things or like spoke about their doubt, because it made me feel less alone.
Yeah, it gives you permission.
Yeah. So,
well, thanks again, Enrique.
No, thank you.
Cool. Yep. Cheers.